you for joining us. We are about to present our presentation for Dr. Frazier's Educational Psychology class. But before we begin, let me introduce my group. This is Robert Ogburn, Bruce Hubbard, and I am Kiera Cornwell.
In the case study Double Trouble, the school district mandated the mainstreaming of special education students into the general education classroom. Art, the special education teacher, in the case study, introduced 2 special education students into Martha's general education classroom. Martha was not notified ahead of time of the placement of these special education students into her classroom and was not prepared for them the morning that they arrived. Within the first hour, Martha became overwhelmed by the needs of these special education students. As the day went on, Martha and Art experienced physical altercations among students. One special education student attempted to flee the school grounds, and the overall education of special education and general education students suffered.
Today we will discuss the 3 major issues which led to the implementation of Mission Mainstream.
The district's interpretation of least restrictive environment resulted in an inadequate plan for the implementation of inclusion of special education students in the general education classroom.
In particular, the lack of a process for individualized education programs, IEPs, affected Art and Martha's ability to effectively meet the students' needs. In addition, the rigid approach to co-teaching and pull-out services for special education students led to an inappropriate placement of students.
By expanding their view of least restrictive environment, having all personnel involved with special education students being a part of the IEP team, and knowing their individual roles, the district will have an effective plan for the inclusion of special education students.
Least restrictive environment involves providing students with an education in an environment that is as close to the general education classroom as they can tolerate. It was designed to allow students with disabilities to be educated with their counterparts without disabilities. In Double Trouble, the district's only concern was placing special education students in general education classrooms. They made very rash decisions about placements as if their main priority was placing students instead of ensuring that they were in their best environment. The district neglected to consider the effect of their rigid view of least restrictive environment on special education students, general education students, and educators. Stephen J. Taylor discusses that least restrictive environment is associated with providing special education students with a learning environment that is as close to normal as possible. Bill and Evan, 2 special education students, were placed in a general education classroom, which is considered a normal learning environment. Evan was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Evan was disorganized, he had trouble concentrating, and he struggled with staying in his seat during class. In addition to this, Evan has trouble reading and is on a lower level academically than his peers. Bill, on the other hand, has a serious behavior problem. He is constantly disrupting the class and picking fights with the other students. Both students were placed in what was considered a normal learning environment, but neither was able to thrive in this environment. Evan was literally getting lost in the classroom, and he was not receiving the attention that he needed. Bill was in an environment that was way too stimulating for him, and he was not able to focus on his work. Both students would benefit more from being placed in a learning environment that is able to nurture them and give them the attention that they need. The least restrictive environment mandate was put into place with special education students in mind, not general education students. It seems as though the rights of the majority are sometimes neglected to focus on the rights of the minority. Bill and Evan were placed in Martha's general education classroom at the expense of the general education students in the room. With all of the distractions caused by these 2 students, The quality of education for the general education students declined in Double Trouble when Bill and Evan were placed into the classroom. While it is understood that the rights of the special education students should be deemed important, the rights of the general education students should be deemed just as important. Now, in Double Trouble, both the general education and special education teachers were unprepared to teach both populations of students in the same classroom. Art and Martha, when in the classroom together, were still unable to successfully manage their two special education students and the rest of their students. There needed to be one teacher present just to tend to Bill's needs, and Evan also required a lot of attention. Martha was presented with a very overwhelming task. She was asked to meet the needs of her general education students and then to meet the needs of the two special education students that she was not at all equipped to handle. Sham and Bond discussed that the reality is that many general education teachers are not prepared and do not feel confident in educating students with special needs. An unrealistic expectation has been placed on the educators. The district's interpretation of least restrictive environment and their rash placement of special education students in the general education classroom has negatively affected all parties involved.
The Individualized Education Program, or more commonly called the IEP, is a program that is mandated by the Individual with Disability Education Act, IDEA. The IEP is designed to provide adequate educational services for children with disabilities in order to help them meet their educational goals. The IEP is structured to meet the individual students' specific needs based on their particular disabilities. The IEP is used to ensure that all students with disabilities are receiving adequate instruction in special education as well as appropriate placement in the general education classroom. In accordance with the Individuals with Disabilities Act, IDEA, legislation, a student with suspected disabilities must undergo an evaluation. The evaluation will be conducted by a representative of the school district. Once the evaluation has been determined that a student is classified as a child with disabilities as identified by IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act, he or she will be eligible to receive special education or related services outlined by IDEA. In the diagram that should be coming up, it illustrates how the individual education plan, IEP, is developed around a student. An IEP is tailored to each individual student. The IEP is a shared responsibility between the school and the parent or the legal guardian of the student. Special education is not a placement, but a service that is designed to help the student in their education or reach their educational goals. LRE, or least restricted environment, that can vary from student to student. General education curriculum, standards, and assessments. The student with IEP will undergo modifications and accommodations that will assist the general education teacher in assisting the students in this area. Because of the IEP is tailored for each student, it reflects the student's strengths and weaknesses and also their needs. The IEP outlines strategies, interventions that will help manage students with behavior problems. And also, last but not least, the IEP, it measures and tracks the students' progress and their development.
Throughout the case study, it appears that more service time may be required in order to best meet Bill and Evan's needs in the classroom. By Art only being in the class 3 times a week for an hour, it has become apparent that Bill and Evan's needs are not being met. Martha is becoming more frustrated and is losing control of her entire class. At this point, a possible solution would be for the IEP committee to re-meet and look at further service models that would be appropriate to meet the needs of Evan and Bill within the classroom. The first approach of service models of co-teaching would be to have one teach and one observe. And the one teach and one observe model, the teacher would, the general education teacher would be responsible for the overall instruction of the classroom, while the other teacher would be responsible for monitoring and observing the behaviors of the students. Another co-teach approach that may be used in this situation would be one teach and one assist. And the one teach and one assist model, the general education teacher would be held responsible for teaching the overall classroom, while a special education teacher could be responsible for assisting with a small group or individual students. Another model that would be appropriate would be parallel teaching. In parallel teaching, the class could be broken up into two separate groups, and one teacher teaching a smaller group of students, another teacher teaching the other group. By doing so, you'd have a smaller student to teacher ratio. Another possible co-teaching area would be station teaching. In station teaching, you'd have several centers focused on the same standard, and each teacher would model and walk the students through the various stations as they move through. This would provide more activity, more involvement for the students as a whole in general. In the case double trouble, alternative teaching could have been used similar to one teach and one assist approach by Martha taking responsibility for the larger group and having Art use specialized strategies and accommodations to help Bill and Evan in a small group setting. When all reasonable attempts at co-teaching and mainstreaming students have been made, and the students' needs are still not being met, it may be time to have another IEP meeting and then look at other possible services, including pull-out and small group instruction. The Double Trouble case study does not directly address this area for pull-out services. However, if more time were taken in the case study, it could be carried out for a longer period, and if Bill and Evan were still not making progress and the frustration level on the teacher and the students were growing, then you'd look at small group instruction. Bill's behaviors, if they continued, even in a co-teaching model, would be made apparent. A possible solution would be to place Bill in a pull-out classroom to focus on his individual needs and his attention. Once those needs were met, Bill and Evan could be looked towards mainstreaming them and beginning to move them back into the general ed classroom. By no means is pull-out a final destination. Instead, pull-out should be used more as a place where students could get more help as needed.
Now, what led Art and Martha School District towards implementing Mission Mainstream? As a result of the district's test scores on standardized tests involving special education students, a red flag was raised that there was some kind of issue going on in the schools because the special education students were not at all achieving as they should.
Each school will be required to send 2 representatives, an administrator and the lead special education teacher, to a district-wide training that will be held at the beginning of the school year. Upon completion of the workshop, the attendees will be required to facilitate the training at their individual schools to the members and teachers at that school.
Mission Mainstream focuses, there are 3 of them. First, the district overall interpretation of the least restrictive environment for the students with disabilities. Second, the improvement of the IEP process and the team's members' responsibility. And third, the various specialized services available to implement for Mission Mainstream students. Upon completion of the workshop, each participant will receive the following brochure, which outlines the 3 focuses for Mission Mainstream.
And as Bruce stated, this brochure will basically outline the 3 focus areas and give each participant a little more information that they will need to actually a change in the classroom so that both the general education students and the special education students can benefit and get a more quality education.
By having a brochure also, Mission Mainstream provides the brochure in order for the general ed and special education teacher to take away something, to hold on to something that they could always refer back to in case they forget or need a refresher. The following 3 slides will show the references used in the development of our presentation and the implementation of Mission Mainstream. We appreciate your attention to our presentation, and we hope that you enjoyed, and we hope that Mission Mainstream will help better educate students and mainstream special education students into the general education classroom in the future. Thank you again for watching.